She was 25 and for all intents and purposes, homeless. She had no family, no prospects, and no plan. Just a small wooden trunk, a silver thimble, and $4 to her name. And with those $4, she bought an abandoned, bullet-scarred stagecoach in the dusty heart of 1880s Wyoming. But what nobody knew, what the jeering crowd and the weary sheriff could not see, was that the secret locked behind its chained doors was not a curse, but a reckoning that would change her life. And the entire county, forever. Settle in close for this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Her story is one worth hearing. Cora Holt had learned the world through the eye of a needle. She was the daughter of a prospector who found nothing but an early grave in the Black Hills, and a mother who followed him into the dust a year later from grief and consumption. Orphaned at 10, she was taken in by her maternal grandmother, Elspeth, a woman whose spine was as straight and unyielding as her darning needle. Elspeth was not a woman given to sentiment. She did not offer hugs or soft words, but she offered something Cora came to understand as more valuable: competence. Elspeth's hands, though knotted with age, were masters of their domain. She could turn a worn-out wool blanket into a boy's winter coat, spin flax into the finest thread, and stitch a line of embroidery so delicate it looked like a painted flower petal. She taught Cora that survival was a craft, and that a straight seam held the world together more surely than any promise. "Pay attention to the materials," Elspeth would say, her voice as dry as autumn leaves. "Know the difference between cotton and linen by touch alone. Know the weight of good thread. A woman who can make and mend is a woman who will never truly be helpless." Cora learned. She learned to patch canvas torn by a hailstorm, to re-stitch the leather harness of a mule, and to sew seed pearls onto a wedding dress for the banker's daughter. Her grandmother's only gift of affection was a small, heavy silver thimble, worn smooth and featureless on its dimpled top from a lifetime of use. "It will protect you," Elspeth had said, placing it in Cora's palm. It was the only time Cora ever saw moisture in the old woman's eyes. After Elspeth passed peacefully in her sleep 2 winters ago, Cora was truly alone. She took a position as a live-in seamstress for the family of Silas Croft, the wealthiest man in Absolution Creek, a man who owned the bank, the largest cattle ranch, and the allegiance of nearly every man on the county council. Cora's life became a quiet rhythm of mending, altering, and creating, her world confined to a small, sun-filled sewing room at the back of the Grand Croft house. She was good at her work, her stitches tiny and perfect, her ability to salvage a ruined garment bordering on miraculous. But her skill made her invisible. She was a pair of useful hands, a quiet presence, who took her meals in the kitchen and was never spoken to unless a hem was crooked or a button was loose. She was furniture that could sew. Her dismissal was as quiet and bloodless as a pinprick. Mrs. Amelia Croft, a woman whose face was perpetually pinched with dissatisfaction, called her into the main parlor on a Tuesday morning. The room was overwarm, smelling of beeswax and wilted roses. Mrs. Croft did not ask her to sit. She stood by the marble mantelpiece, twisting a lace handkerchief in her hands. "Cora," she began, her voice thin and devoid of any warmth. "As you know, Mr. Croft's businesses have faced some unfortunate setbacks of late. We find ourselves in the regrettable position of having to economize." Cora stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked at the woman's silk dress, at the intricate Brussels lace at the collar, and knew the lie for what it was. Her work was flawless. Her keep was negligible. This was not about economy. This was about whim, or perhaps something she had overheard. A piece of a conversation not meant for her ears about missing mail shipments and angry investors. She had learned long ago to make herself deaf as well as invisible. Clearly, she had failed. "I see," Cora said. Her own voice was steady, a credit to her grandmother's training in keeping a placid exterior. "I will need to make some adjustments to the household staff," Mrs. Croft continued, avoiding Cora's gaze. Your services, while adequate, will no longer be required. She gestured to a small envelope on the mantel. That is your final wage. You will have until noon to gather your belongings and vacate the premises. There was no argument to be made. To argue would be to beg, and Cora Holt would not beg. She gave a small, formal nod. Thank you, madam. She took the envelope, turned, and walked out of the parlor, her back as straight as Elspeth's had always been. In her small room, she did not weep. She opened her small wooden trunk, the one her father had made, and began to pack. It did not take long. She had few possessions: 3 spare dresses, her sewing kit with its neat rows of needles and spools of thread, a book of poetry, and her grandmother's silver thimble, which she kept in a small duskin pouch. She packed methodically, folding each garment with practiced precision. She opened the envelope. Inside were 4 silver dollars. A month's wage. It was what she was owed, but it was also an insult. It was just enough to be technically fair and practically useless. At precisely 11:30, she carried her trunk down the back stairs and out the kitchen door. The cook, a woman named Mary, pressed a bundle of bread and cheese into her hand, her eyes full of pity. Cora thanked her and walked away from the Croft house without looking back. She had no destination. The sun was high and hot, beating down on the wide, dusty main street of Absolution Creek. The Wyoming wind, a constant presence, did little to cool the air, serving only to lift dust from the street and coat Cora's dark skirt with a film of pale grit. She carried her trunk in one hand, the bundled food in the other. The weight of the trunk was familiar, but today it felt heavier, an anchor pulling her down into a future she could not imagine. People watched her from the shade of covered boardwalks. They knew who she was, the Crofts' seamstress. To see her walking with her trunk at midday was a public declaration of her fall from grace. She felt their stares like small, sharp stones against her skin, but she kept her eyes forward, her pace even. She had no family to turn to, no friends to ask for shelter. Her grandmother's small cabin had been sold to pay for the burial. She walked the length of the town, from the imposing stone facade of Croft's Bank at one end to the dusty livery at the other. A slow patrol of her own diminishing options. A room at the boarding house would cost $1 a night. Her $4 would last her 4 nights. And then what? She could not bring herself to spend the money on such a temporary solution. It felt like setting fire to her only lifeboat. As she neared the county jail, a squat, unlovely building of rough-hewn timber, she saw a small crowd gathered in the open lot beside it. A man stood on a wooden crate, his voice carrying on the wind. It was the county sheriff, a portly, balding man named Brody, and he was conducting an auction. Curiosity, or perhaps just the desire to stop walking, drew her closer. The object of the auction was a derelict stagecoach. It was a ruin, a Concorde, by the look of it, its elegant curved body scarred and battered. The once bright red paint was peeling, revealing weathered gray wood beneath. The gold lettering on the door, though faded, was still legible: Overland Mail. One of the wheels was splintered, the leather thoroughbraces that served as suspension were dry-rotted and slack, and the canvas top was ripped and tattered. The entire coach listed to one side like a foundering ship. There were at least 3 bullet holes in the side panel, dark and ugly against the faded red. But its most striking feature was the heavy, rust-pitted chain that was wrapped around and around the body, passed through the wheel spokes, and secured with 2 enormous, grim-looking padlocks. "All right, folks," Sheriff Brody called out, wiping sweat from his brow. "You all know this coach, been sitting here for 6 months. It's the one from the Pine Ridge ambush. Found it abandoned. No driver, no guard, no horses, no mail, just this." He gestured to the wreck. A murmur went through the crowd. "Cursed," someone whispered. "Bad luck." "The Overland Company's written it off," the sheriff continued. "Said it's not worth hauling back, so the county's selling it for storage fees. What am I bid for this piece of Wyoming history?" He was met with silence. A ranch hand laughed. History? That thing's firewood, Brody, and haunted firewood at that. I'll give you $1 for the locks, another man called out. What's inside? A woman asked. Don't know, the sheriff admitted with a shrug. Chained when we found it. Company man didn't have a key, and we weren't paid to break it open. Could be empty. Could be full of gold bricks. Could be full of ghosts. Sold as is, where is? Do I hear a bid? Cora looked at the coach. She saw what they saw. A wreck, a piece of bad luck, a monument to a violent crime. But she also saw something else. She saw shelter. The body, for all its damage, was solid wood. The interior, whatever it held, was a space out of the wind and the sun. It was bigger than a tent. It was a room of a sort. It was a place to put her trunk and herself. $2. A voice called. It was one of Croft's ranch hands, a man looking to make a joke. Sheriff Brody sighed. I have $2. A generous offer. Do I hear 3? Cora's heart began to beat a little faster. An idea, desperate and foolish, took root in her mind. She thought of her $4. She thought of the boarding house. She thought of her grandmother's words. A woman who can make and mend is a woman who will never truly be helpless. She could mend that canvas. She could patch that wood. $3. It was the same ranch hand bidding against himself for the entertainment of his friends. The crowd chuckled. I have 3, Brody said, his voice flat. He was about to close the bidding when Cora found her voice. $4, she said. The words were quiet, but clear. The crowd turned to look at her. The laughter died. Sheriff Brody squinted, surprised. The seamstress? Someone muttered. What's she want with that thing? Cora met the sheriff's gaze and held it. She did not flinch. I have $4. From Miss Holt, Brody announced, a new note of seriousness in his tone. He looked around the crowd. The joking ranch hand was silent, his fun spoiled. No one else spoke. $4 once. $4 twice. Sold. He banged a small wooden gavel against the crate. To Miss Cora Holt, for $4. She walked forward, the crowd parting for her as if she were the ghost they'd been whispering about. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the 4 heavy coins, her entire worldly fortune. She placed them, one by one, into the sheriff's outstretched palm. He gave her a handwritten receipt. She's all yours, miss, he said, not unkindly. Though what you'll do with her, I can't imagine. Cora didn't answer. She just looked at her purchase, the chained and broken coach, and felt the first flicker of something that was not despair. The coach was now hers, a fact that seemed both absurd and profound. It sat immovable in the dusty lot, a monument to her impulsive decision. The crowd dispersed, shaking their heads and murmuring, leaving her alone with her new possession. Ownership, she quickly realized, came with the immediate and pressing problem of logistics. She could not live in it where it stood, in the shadow of the county jail. She needed to move it, and she needed to open it. Both tasks were far beyond her own strength. Her mind, trained in the quiet problem-solving of needle and thread, began to work. To move it, she needed leverage and muscle. To open it, she needed a specialist. Both needs pointed to one place, the blacksmith's forge. She knew of the blacksmith, Samuel Vale. He was a quiet man, broad-shouldered and solitary, who had come to Absolution Creek a few years prior and set up shop at the edge of town. He kept to himself, his days measured by the rhythmic clang of his hammer. He was said to be a master of his craft, a man who could shape iron as if it were clay. Cora walked the short distance to his smithy. The building was dark and cavernous, its open front emitting waves of heat and the sharp, metallic smell of hot iron and coal smoke. Samuel Vale stood before his anvil, his face lit by the orange glow of the forge. He was hammering a glowing bar of iron, his movements economical and powerful. He didn't seem to notice her at first, his entire being focused on the work. Cora waited patiently, not wanting to interrupt the flow of his labor. After a final series of ringing blows, he plunged the iron into a slack tub with a great hiss of steam and turned. He was younger than she had thought, perhaps 30, with a serious, soot-smudged face and calm, intelligent eyes. He looked at her, then at her clean dress and the receipt still clutched in her hand. "Miss," he said. His voice was a low rumble. "I've bought the old overland coach," Cora stated simply, holding up the paper as evidence. He nodded slowly, his eyes showing no surprise. News traveled fast in a town this size, the one by the jail. "Yes," she said. "It is chained. I cannot open it, and I cannot leave it where it is. I need it moved, and I need the chains cut." He wiped his hands on a leather apron, his gaze steady. He was appraising her, she knew, just as he would appraise a piece of metal, looking for flaws, for strength. "Where would you move it?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "Someplace out of the way. I have no money left to pay you. I spent it all on the coach." She expected him to turn her away then, but he did not. He looked past her out toward the main street, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing something more than just her request. "There's a clear patch of ground behind my smithy," he said after a long moment. "It's level. Belongs to me. You could put it there, for now." Cora felt a wave of relief so strong it almost buckled her knees. "And the chains? I will cut them," he said. "But moving it is a two-man job. More, with that busted wheel." He thought for a moment. "I'll get my heavy lever dolly, and I'll ask Jed from the livery to bring a draft horse to pull. He owes me a favor." He looked at her again. "It will take some time." "I have time," Cora said. Samuel gave a short, sharp nod, as if a contract had been sealed. He went to the livery, and Cora returned to the coach to wait, guarding it like a nervous mother. Within the hour, Samuel returned with a burly, good-natured man named Jed and a massive Belgian draft horse. Together, the two men worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency. They used jacks and levers to lift the wounded side of the coach, sliding a heavy wooden sledge underneath the broken wheel. They hitched the horse to the front axle, and with a great groaning of wood and straining of leather, the coach began to move. It scraped and swayed, a wounded beast being dragged to a new lair. Cora walked alongside, her hand resting on the splintered wood, her trunk now stowed on the driver's seat. They guided it slowly through the town, down the side lane to the back of the smithy, and settled it onto the patch of bare, hard-packed earth Samuel had indicated. It looked strangely at home there, nestled between the dark wall of the forge and a stand of resilient, wind-stunted pines. Jed unhitched his horse, gave Cora a respectful tip of his hat, and left. Samuel turned his attention to the chains. The sun was beginning to dip toward the jagged line of the western mountains, casting long shadows across the yard. The air grew cooler. Samuel returned from the depths of his forge carrying a heavy sledgehammer and a long, wickedly sharp cold chisel. He didn't say a word, simply knelt and examined the padlocks. They were thick, brutal things, designed to withstand casual assault. He chose the one securing the chains that were woven through the main body of the coach. He placed the sharp edge of the chisel against the hardened steel shackle of the lock. "Stand back, miss," he advised, his voice low. Cora retreated a few paces. Samuel took a breath, his shoulders bunching under his shirt. He lifted the sledgehammer, and for a moment he seemed to her like a figure from mythology, a god of the forge about to pronounce judgment. He swung the hammer in a short, powerful arc. The impact of steel on steel was not the ringing clang of the anvil, but a deafening, percussive crack that echoed off the wall of the smithy. It was a sound of violation, of something strong being broken. He swung again, and again, a steady, brutal rhythm. A chip of metal flew, sparking against the ground. Cora watched, mesmerized by the focused violence of the act. This was the opposite of her own work, the slow, careful joining of things. This was a forceful separation. After a dozen blows, There was a sharp, final snap, and the shackle of the first lock gave way, falling to the dust. Samuel moved to the second lock without pausing, his breathing steady, his movements economical. He was not rushing, he was simply working at the pace the task required. The second lock took less time to break. With another sharp crack, it too fell away. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the sigh of the wind in the pines. The chains, their tension released, sagged against the wooden body of the coach. Samuel rose and began the laborious process of unwrapping them, the heavy links dragging and clanking in the dirt. When the last loop was pulled free, the coach door was finally clear. Samuel stepped back, wiping a smear of grime from his cheek with the back of his hand. He looked from the door to Cora. "It's open," he said, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. But the words hung in the air, full of possibility. For 6 months, the contents of the coach had been a mystery, a subject of morbid speculation. Now, the answer was behind a simple, unlocked door. Cora felt a tremor of apprehension mixed with a strange, possessive excitement. This was her property. The secret inside, for good or ill, belonged to her. She stepped forward, her hand reaching for the tarnished brass handle. She hesitated. A faint, unpleasant odor seeped from the seams of the door, not just the mustiness of damp and disuse, but something else, something organic and faintly medicinal. It smelled of stale sweat, old blood, and the sharp tang of liniment. Her brief fantasy of finding gold bricks evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. She took a firm grip on the handle, turned it, and pulled. The door, swollen in its frame, resisted. She pulled harder, her shoulder pressed against the panel. With a great groaning shriek of wood against wood, the door swung inward, opening into the deep gloom of the coach's interior. The light from the setting sun did not penetrate far into the coach. The interior was a cavern of shadows and vague shapes. Cora peered inside, her eyes struggling to adjust. She could make out the 2 bench seats, their leather upholstery torn in several places, spilling horsehair stuffing onto the floor. The floor itself was littered with debris, scraps of paper, a broken bottle, the general detritus of a violent event left to fester for half a year. But it was the floor that held her attention. Even in the dim light, she could see a pattern of deep scuff marks and scratches that made no sense. They were concentrated in the center aisle, as if something heavy had been dragged or repeatedly shifted back and forth. A normal passenger's boots wouldn't have made such marks. Kneeling at the threshold, she reached inside, her fingers tracing the rough grooves in the wood. Her seamstress's eye for detail, for things that were out of place, took over. She noticed that the central floorboards were a slightly different color from those along the edges, a shade darker, as if they had been oiled or treated differently. And there, almost hidden beneath the edge of the forward bench, was a small, unnatural-looking hole, no bigger than her thumb. It looked like a finger pull. "I need a lamp," she said, her voice hushed. Samuel, who had been watching her silently, nodded and disappeared into the smithy. He returned a moment later with a lit storm lantern, its steady yellow flame pushing back the gloom. He handed it to her. Cora held the lantern high and leaned into the coach. The light cast dancing shadows, making the interior seem alive and sinister. She held it low, illuminating the floor. Now she could see it clearly. There was a distinct rectangle outlined in the floorboards, a seam so fine she had missed it in the fading light. The finger hole was set into one of its edges. It was a trapdoor, a false floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the secret. She set the lantern down on the dusty seat and tried to pull the door up. It was heavy and tightly fitted. "Let me," Samuel said. He reached past her, his large, capable fingers finding the hole. He gave a sharp, upward tug. The panel resisted, then lifted with a soft pop of released pressure, revealing a dark, narrow space beneath. The smell that rose from the opening was stronger now, thick and human. It was the smell of a sick room, of a wound, of a long and desperate confinement. Cora held the lantern over the opening and looked down. And then she saw him. A man was lying in the shallow compartment, which was no more than a foot deep. He was wedged into the space, his body bound with leather straps that were bolted to the true floor of the coach. His face was pale and gaunt, covered in a dirty, matted beard. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was so shallow she could barely detect it. He was dressed in the dusty, torn remains of a uniform, a stage-line guard. One of his legs was crudely splinted, and a dark, ugly stain marked his thigh. He was alive, but only just. Beside him, tucked into the narrow space between his body and the wall of the compartment, was a thick, leather-bound book. A ledger. For a moment, neither Cora nor Samuel moved or spoke. The only sound was the whisper of the wind and the faint, rasping breath of the man in the hole. This was the curse of the stagecoach. Not a ghost, but a man, left to die in a hidden coffin. They hadn't chained the coach to keep people out. They had chained it to keep him in. The quiet shock gave way to urgent action. "We have to get him out," Cora said, her voice tight but controlled. Samuel nodded, his face a grim mask in the lantern light. Working together in the cramped space, they began to unbuckle the straps. The leather was stiff and the buckles were rusted, but Samuel's strong fingers worked them loose one by one. The man did not stir. When the last strap was free, they carefully, gently, lifted him from the compartment. He was lighter than he should have been, his body wasted by starvation and injury. They carried him out of the coach and into the cool evening air, laying him on a clean horse blanket Samuel had fetched from the smithy. Cora knelt beside him. She felt for the pulse in his neck. It was there, a faint, thready flutter. As Samuel went to fetch water, Cora reached back into the coach and retrieved the ledger. It was heavy, its cover stained and scuffed. She opened it. The pages were filled with neat, precise columns of handwriting. It was a record of shipments, dates, and names. But beside many of the entries were other notations, written in a different, hastier hand. They were records of kickbacks, of shorted shipments, of payments made to individuals. She saw the name Silas Croft. She saw the names of 2 of his ranch foremen, and the name of a deputy sheriff. It was a meticulous record of a criminal conspiracy, a detailed account of how the overland mail was being systematically robbed, not by bandits on the road, but by the most powerful men in Absolution Creek. The man on the blanket had not been a victim of a random ambush. He had been a witness. The immediate need was to keep the man alive. His secret, and theirs, would die with him. Samuel returned with a bucket of fresh water and a tin cup. Cora soaked a corner of a clean rag from her trunk and gently began to wash the man's face. His skin was cold to the touch. She moistened his lips, and a low groan escaped them. His eyelids flickered. "He needs a doctor," Samuel said, his voice low and grave. "Dr. Finch. He's old, but he's the only one. Will he come?" Cora asked, her eyes not leaving the man's face. The names in that ledger were a threat to anyone who offered them aid. "He'll come," Samuel said with a certainty that surprised her. "He and Croft have no love for each other. I'll fetch him." While Samuel was gone, Cora turned her full attention to the stranger. She had her sewing kit, which also contained fine, sharp scissors. She carefully cut away the fabric of his trousers around the wound on his thigh. The splint was a crude affair of scavenged wood and torn strips of cloth. Beneath it, the wound was inflamed and angry, a deep gash that had been poorly stitched. It needed to be cleaned and closed properly. When Dr. Finch arrived, he was a stooped, white-haired man with weary eyes and hands stained with nicotine. He carried a worn leather bag. He looked from Cora to the unconscious man, then to Samuel, who stood like a sentinel by the forge door. The doctor knelt, his examination swift and practiced. "Gunshot," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Happened some time ago. Infection set in. He's starving and badly dehydrated. It's a miracle he's breathing at all." He opened his bag. "I'll need hot water." lots of it, and clean linen. Cora was already a step ahead, having put a kettle on the small stove in the corner of the smithy. While the water heated, the doctor gave the man a few sips of laudanum, mixed with water to dull the pain. Then, with Cora assisting, he began the grim work. He cleaned the wound, removing the old, clumsy stitches. Cora watched his hands, the way he held his instruments, the precise, economical movements. He was a craftsman, just like her grandmother, just like Samuel. When the wound was clean, he looked at Cora. "It needs closing. My eyes aren't what they were for fine work." He gestured to the needle and surgical thread. "You're the seamstress. You do it." Cora did not hesitate. This was work she understood. Using a fine, curved needle, she began to close the wound, her stitches small, even, and tight, just as Elspeth had taught her. She worked with calm focus, her mind shutting out everything but the task. The doctor watched her, a flicker of approval in his tired eyes. "You have a surgeon's hand, girl," he murmured. When she was finished, they bandaged the leg tightly. Dr. Finch administered a powder for the fever and left a small bottle of tonic. "Keep him warm. Get some broth into him if he wakes. The next day will tell the tale." He looked at Samuel. "No one needs to know I was here." Samuel simply nodded. After the doctor left, they moved the man into a small, windowless storage room at the back of the smithy, laying him on a cot Samuel produced. It was the most secure place they had. Cora sat by the cot, the ledger in her lap, the storm lantern casting a low, steady light. Samuel banked the fire in the forge and then stood at the door of the small room. "His name is Boone Ashford," he said quietly. Cora looked up. "I saw his nameplate on his uniform," Samuel explained. "He was a guard, a good one. Heard he was straight as an arrow. That's probably what got him shot." He looked at the ledger in her hands. "That book is the reason. And it's the reason they'll come looking." Cora knew he was right. The men who had left Boone Ashford to die would not have simply forgotten about the coach. They must have been waiting for the fuss to die down, for a chance to dispose of it, and its contents, quietly. Her purchase at the public auction had thrown a wrench in their plans. Now, they would be watching, waiting. The smithy was no longer just a workshop. It was a fortress, and she, the dismissed seamstress, was its unlikely castellan. For the next 2 days, Cora did not leave Boone's side. She spoon-fed him water and, later, a thin, clear broth that Martha Gable, the wife of the general store owner, brought by without a word of explanation. Mrs. Gable had simply appeared at the smithy door with a covered pot and a stack of clean linen, her face set in a look of grim determination. She met Cora's eyes, nodded once, and left. It was an act of silent alliance, a small but significant crack in the wall of fear Silas Croft had built around the town. Boone drifted in and out of a feverish consciousness. He mumbled names, Croft's name among them, and phrases. Told them no, the manifest is short. Under the floor he was reliving the ambush, the betrayal by men he thought were his comrades. Cora listened, piecing together the story that the ledger only outlined. He had discovered the scheme. He had refused to be a part of it. So they had staged a fake robbery, shot him, and hidden him, planning to let him die slowly and silently, where no one would ever find him. During the long hours, Cora tended to her other patient, the coach. She took her sewing kit outside and began the laborious process of mending the torn canvas roof. Using a heavy waxed thread and a sailmaker's palm to drive the needle, she stitched the rips together, with strong, overlapping seams. It was hard, physical work, but it was grounding. With every stitch she felt less like a victim and more like a proprietor. She was not just hiding, she was building. She was making her $4 investment into a home. Samuel worked at his forge, the rhythmic ringing of his hammer a steady, reassuring heartbeat for their small sanctuary. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant source of strength. He sharpened tools, repaired a broken hinge on the storeroom door, and kept a watchful eye on the lane. They were two quiet people, bound by a secret and a shared sense of duty. On the third day, the fever broke. Boone Ashford woke up, truly woke up, for the first time. His eyes, clear now and startlingly blue in his gaunt face, fixed on Cora. "Where?" he whispered, his voice a dry crackle. "You're safe," Cora told him gently. "You're in the blacksmith's forge in Absolution Creek. You were in the coach." Recognition, then fear, dawned in his eyes. "The ledger, it's safe too," she said, showing him the book. Relief washed over his face, so profound it seemed to leave him exhausted. Over the next few days, as his strength slowly returned, he told them the full story. He was an inspector for the Overland Mail Company, sent to investigate irregularities on the Absolution Creek route. He'd worked undercover as a guard. He had gathered the evidence, documenting it all in the ledger, and was preparing to take it to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. Croft's men, including Deputy Miller, had confronted him on the Pine Ridge Trail. They offered him a share. He refused. They shot him, took the official mail sacks to make it look like a robbery, and locked him in the coach's hidden compartment, which they knew about from a previous owner. They chained the coach and left it for the sheriff to find, figuring it would sit as evidence for months until they could arrange for it to be lost or destroyed in a fire. They never thought anyone would buy it, Boone finished, his voice gaining strength. And they certainly never thought anyone would open it. As Boone recovered, their small circle of allies grew, one quiet person at a time. Jed, the liveryman, began stabling his horses at night in a way that blocked the lane leading to the back of the smithy, creating a subtle barricade. Dr. Finch paid another visit, this time bringing a bottle of whiskey for medicinal purposes and sharing a game of checkers with Boone. Martha Gable continued her deliveries of food, sometimes a pot of stew, sometimes a freshly baked loaf of bread. No one spoke of the ledger. No one asked questions. They simply did what needed to be done. They were the town's quiet dissenters, the ones who had not been bought or intimidated by Silas Croft. Cora's presence and her stubborn refusal to be scared away had given them a banner to rally to. The stagecoach, now sitting squarely behind the smithy, became the symbol of this quiet rebellion. Cora had finished mending the roof. She scrubbed the interior from top to bottom, washing away the stains and the ghosts of Boone's confinement. She used her skills to patch the torn leather seats, reinforcing them with sturdy canvas from the inside where it wouldn't show. She cleaned the brass lanterns until they shone. The coach was no longer a tomb. It was her space. She moved her trunk inside, arranged her few belongings, and at night she slept on one of the benches, the solid wood of the coach surrounding her like a fortress. It was a strange, cramped, and beautiful home. One evening, Samuel found her sitting on the coach's driver's box, watching the stars come out in the vast Wyoming sky. He handed her a cup of hot coffee. "You've done good work on her," he said, nodding at the coach. "My grandmother taught me to mend things," Cora replied. "She said nothing is ever truly ruined. It's just waiting for the right pair of hands." Samuel was quiet for a long time, sipping his own coffee. "Croft knows," he said finally. "The talk in town has gone quiet. Too quiet. His men are watching. They know something's changed." "Let them watch," Cora said, her voice steady. She felt a calm resolve she had never known before. She was no longer the invisible seamstress. She was the woman with the stagecoach. People in town knew her name now. When she walked to the general store, they didn't stare with pity. They nodded with a kind of grudging respect. She had taken a cursed thing and given it a purpose. In doing so, she had found her own. The coach was no longer a burden. It was her proof, her refuge, and her anchor in this dusty, wind-scoured world. It was a place filled not with luxury, but with something far more valuable, a hard-won dignity. The confrontation came, as they knew it would, not with a whisper, but with a boot kicking open the front door of the smithy. It was just after dawn. Two of Croft's ranch hands, burly men with cruel faces, stood silhouetted against the morning light. Behind them in the street, Cora could see Deputy Miller, the man Boone had named, his face pale and sweating. Vale, the first man, snarled, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "We've come for the coach." "Mr. Crofts decided he wants it." Samuel, who had been starting the morning fire in the forge, slowly turned. He held a heavy iron poker in his hand, its tip still glowing a dull red. "The coach belongs to Miss Holt," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "She bought it, fair and square." "We're not asking," the second man said, stepping into the smithy. From the back room, the door opened and Boone Ashford appeared. He was leaning on a crutch fashioned from a hickory branch, but he stood tall. In his other hand, he held an old but well-oiled Colt revolver that Samuel had given him. "You're looking for me, I reckon," Boone said, his voice clear and strong. The ranch hands froze, their bravado faltering at the sight of the man they had left for dead. They had come for a woman and a blacksmith. They hadn't counted on a ghost armed and ready. "You should have stayed dead, Ashford," the first man growled, his hand tightening on his gun. At that moment, Cora stepped out from behind the coach, holding the ledger. She wasn't aiming a weapon. She was holding up the truth. "It's all in here," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the tension. "Every dollar you stole, every lie you told. Deputy Miller, your name is on page 17. In the street, the deputy flinched as if he'd been struck. The standoff held for a breathless second. Then, from up the street, another sound, the steady tread of an organized group of people. Jed from the livery appeared, flanked by Dr. Finch. Behind them were a half-dozen other townspeople, shopkeepers, stable hands, farmers, all of them silent, all of them watching. They carried no guns, but their presence was a weapon in itself. It was the town, awake and bearing witness. Silas Croft's power had always relied on the town's fear and silence. Now, the silence was broken. The first ranch hand, seeing his advantage slipping away, made a desperate move, his hand darting for his pistol. But he never cleared the leather. Samuel moved with astonishing speed, the glowing poker swinging in a short, sharp arc, striking the man's gun hand. The man screamed, dropping his pistol as the smell of seared flesh filled the air. Before the second man could react, Boone leveled his revolver. "Don't," he said calmly. The fight was over before it had truly begun. Sheriff Brody arrived then, looking flustered and afraid. He saw the scene, the injured man, the armed guard, the blacksmith standing like an iron statue, the woman holding the book, and the silent crowd of citizens. Cora walked directly to him and placed the ledger in his hands. "This is the evidence, Sheriff," she said. "Now you have to choose." Brody looked at the ledger, at the faces of his townspeople, and then at the pale, terrified face of his own deputy. The choice was no choice at all. He drew his pistol and pointed it at the two ranch hands. "It's over," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "You're under arrest." Months later, the Wyoming sun shone down on a different kind of Absolution Creek. Silas Croft and his conspirators were gone, their assets seized by the federal government, their reign of fear broken by a seamstress, a blacksmith, and a man who refused to die. The town seemed to breathe more easily, the air itself lighter. The stagecoach was fully restored, its red paint gleaming, its wheels true. The lettering, Overland Mercantile, painted in fresh gold on its side. It was Cora's. She had turned it into a traveling store, stocked with goods from Cheyenne, serving the outlying ranches and homesteads that the town's main stores ignored. Boone Ashford was her partner, his leg now fully healed. He handled the horses and the heavy lifting, his quiet competence a perfect match for her own. On a bright autumn afternoon, Cora sat on the driver's box, waiting for Boone to finish loading the last of their supplies. The coach was parked in the same spot behind the smithy, but it was no longer a refuge. It was a place of business, a symbol of a new beginning. In her pocket, her fingers found the smooth, cool surface of her grandmother's silver thimble. It was her connection to the past, to the woman who had taught her that mending was a form of creation. Beside her on the seat lay the ledger, now just an empty, scarred book, its pages having been entered as evidence in federal court. It was Boone's testament, the physical proof of his endurance. She thought of Mrs. Croft's parlor, of the $4 that had felt like both an ending and an insult. She thought of the jeering crowd and the cursed, broken thing she had bought with that money. It was the best $4 she had ever spent. Cora Holt was 25, and she was home. She had a thriving business, a trusted partner, and the respect of a town that had once pitied her. She had started with $4 and a trunk full of memories, and with them, she had purchased a ruin. That ruin had given her a place to stand, a truth to defend, and a future she could build with her own 2 hands. The Stagecoach, once a symbol of violence and betrayal, was now a sign of hope, its wheels ready to carry her not away from her life, but deeper into it. Boone swung up onto the seat beside her, his smile easy and genuine. He took the reins. "Ready?" he asked. Cora looked out at the wide, open country, at the road that stretched toward the horizon. "I'm ready," she said. She was no longer the dismissed seamstress, the invisible woman in the back room. She was Cora Holt, the woman who bought a cursed stagecoach and found justice strapped inside. She had taken the broken pieces of a life, her own and Boone's, and with patience, skill, and unwavering courage, had stitched them into something whole, something strong, something that would last. It was the finest piece of mending she had ever done. Thank you for joining us for this story of resilience and quiet courage. We believe that strength is often found not in loud declarations, but in the steady work of our own 2 hands. What is something in your life that others saw as broken, but you saw as full of possibility? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Your stories inspire us all, and if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who appreciates a story of hope built from the ground up. Until next time, stay well.